After Japan, another of the United States' closest allies, a nation that for decades has upheld Western military presence in the Pacific, is now considering aligning itself with the BRICS bloc. Does that sound impossible? Yet this is exactly the debate unfolding in Canberra. In recent weeks, outlets such as the Financial Times and Guardian Australia have brought into the open what until recently was considered taboo. Australia is seriously weighing the possibility of switching sides. The spark came from tariffs imposed by Donald Trump. In 2024, the United States raised duties on Australian aluminum and steel, directly impacting an industry responsible for more than 150,000 jobs, according to the Australian Aluminium Council. What was meant to pressure China instead struck at a historic ally. And the question echoing inside the Australian government is blunt. Is it worth continuing to pay the price of loyalty to Washington? The numbers expose a dependency that is hard to ignore. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, more than 35% of Australian exports are destined for China, while the United States accounts for less than 10%. When Trump shut the doors with tariffs, Beijing responded by immediately offering to expand purchases of iron ore and agricultural products, according to the South China Morning Post. The outstretched hand came from the east, not the west. But this isn't just about economics. In an interview with Fox News, Trump declared that the United States will no longer take care of friends who don't follow its rules. For many Australians, that statement felt like humiliation. The domestic debate intensified. Should the nation maintain historic submission to Washington or pursue strategic autonomy alongside China, India, and Russia? What once seemed improbable now takes on the contours of reality. Analysts at the Lowy Institute in Sydney argue that if Australia takes this step, it would mark the most significant geopolitical realignment since the Second World War. But is a nation that has always seen itself as part of the West truly ready to turn its back on Washington? And if Australia were to become the first Western country to cross the Rubicon, choosing the BRICS over the United States, how would the world react to such a seismic shock? The fracture in Canberra. What if Australia's future were being decided in secret meetings, far from the public eye? That is exactly what is happening in Canberra. Behind closed doors, government ministers are split into two camps. On one side, those who defend historic loyalty to the United States. On the other, those who see in China, India, and Russia a way to preserve jobs and ensure growth. This dispute is not only ideological, but deeply practical. When Donald Trump announced tariffs on aluminum, steel, and even Australian agricultural products, the reaction was immediate. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, aluminum exports fell by more than 10% in 2024. The Australian Aluminium Council warned that more than 150,000 jobs were at risk. For ordinary workers, this meant a direct threat to the paycheck that covers their children's school fees or their mortgage. How can you trust a partner who undermines your economy? Meanwhile, Beijing seized the opportunity. According to the South China Morning Post, China sharply increased purchases of Australian iron ore and grains right after the American tariffs. For farmers in the countryside, as reported by ABC News, the feeling was clear. The United States turned its back on us, but China opened its doors. Small rural communities that depend on exports are already feeling in their wallets the weight of these decisions. The conflict takes on strategic contours. Canberra must answer a central question. Should it remain part of the Western Club, even at great cost? Or should it pursue strategic autonomy within a bloc that promises billions in infrastructure and energy investment? For many analysts, including those at the Lowy Institute, the debate has moved beyond theory. It is now a matter of economic and political survival. If you want to follow how this internal struggle could reshape not only Australian politics, but the entire balance of the Pacific, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. With each new chapter, we will be here to analyze what is truly at stake in this potential turning point of history. The economy as compass. More than 35% of everything Australia exports is destined for China, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The United States, on the other hand, represents less than 10%. That simple comparison reveals an uncomfortable truth. Australia's economic dependency already points toward the east, even if its politics still try to face west. Aluminum is just one example. In 2024, when Donald Trump imposed heavy tariffs, the sector saw sales collapse. For industries in Queensland and Victoria, this meant shift cuts, temporary shutdowns, and the looming threat of mass layoffs. The Australian Aluminium Council warned that up to 150,000 jobs could be at stake. The question lingers, How can an ally place so much pressure on the vital sectors of a historic partner? Meanwhile, Beijing saw an opportunity. According to the South China Morning Post, China expanded purchases of Australian iron ore under favorable conditions immediately after the American tariffs. For Beijing, it was not just commerce, it was strategy. But did Canberra fully grasp the magnitude of this move? Inside Australia's private sector, once quiet voices are beginning to rise. The Australian Financial Review recorded statements from business leaders claiming that the survival of supply chains depends more on relations with Beijing than with Washington. That statement sparks an uncomfortable reflection. Is Australia slowly becoming an essential piece on China's chessboard? There is an even more striking point. The data shows that China already accounts for nearly 80% of Australia's iron ore exports. This is the main driver of the nation's trade surplus. If Beijing were ever to reduce or redirect these purchases, what impact would that have on the Australian economy? While the numbers seem to be steering Australia toward the BRICS, an inevitable question emerges. Is this merely an economic issue, or are we about to witness a complete redefinition of the nation's security and sovereignty? The security dilemma. What if Australia, by protecting its historic alliance, were actually signing its own sentence of military vulnerability? That is the question now echoing inside the Ministry of Defence in Canberra. High-ranking officers in testimonies reported by the Sydney Morning Herald have raised an uncomfortable doubt. If the United States goes to war with China, would Australia be automatically dragged into the conflict, becoming a priority target in the Pacific? This uncertainty grows precisely as Beijing expands its economic presence on Australian soil. According to Nikkei Asia, Chinese state banks have already financed multi-billion-dollar projects in renewable energy and transportation infrastructure, including plans for high-speed rail linking Sydney to Melbourne. At the same time, Chinese companies are partnering with Australian universities on technological research, creating ties that go far beyond trade. With every contract signed, Beijing's shadow stretches deeper into the local economy. But how far does this dependency go? In recent reports, the Lowy Institute has warned that China's growing economic penetration creates a structural vulnerability. Any rupture with Beijing could paralyze entire sectors of the Australian economy. And the paradox is clear. Australia, which has always relied on American protection for stability, now finds itself increasingly bound to China for prosperity. Inside Parliament, this dilemma is already sparking tension. Closed-door hearings are debating the future of American military bases on Australian soil. After all, to what extent does hosting Washington's strategic installations make the country a disposable shield in a war that may not even be its own? The dilemma is brutal. Guarantee security through the military alliance with the United States, or pursue prosperity by accepting China's economic influence. But is there really room for balance? Or will Australia be forced to choose a side once and for all? The American pillar at risk for decades, Australia has been described as the silent pillar of the United States strategy in the Indo-Pacific. In Darwin, in the Northern Territory, American troops have rotated annually since 2012, under an agreement designed to contain China's growing influence. Intelligence bases such as Pine Gap, in the heart of the Australian desert, are essential for monitoring satellites and global communications, according to the Australian National University. But what if this pillar were beginning to crack? Inside the White House, alarms have already gone off. The Washington Post revealed that Donald Trump's advisors are preparing emergency packages, ranging from new military agreements to promises of investment, to keep Canberra loyal. Yet there is a problem. Military security is no longer enough. In daily life, Australians see prices rising, jobs under threat, and greater opportunities coming from the East. How can leaders justify to the population that loyalty should outweigh immediate economic interests? Agriculture provides a clear example. Farmers in the interior of Queensland told ABC News that long-term contracts with Chinese buyers brought stability, while American markets closed due to tariffs. For them, the equation is simple. Whoever guarantees the sale of production deserves trust. The hard question is, what good are military bases if rural economies are collapsing? At this stage, the narrative takes on a paradoxical tone. The United States offers shields and missiles, but China offers contracts and jobs. For business leaders in Sydney and Melbourne, quoted by the Australian Financial Review, the pragmatic choice is already made. Without China, there is no sustainable growth. We stand at a historic impasse. On one side, decades of inherited military alliance with Washington. On the other, an economic reality pushing the country toward Beijing. This conflict is not merely diplomatic. It touches the life of every worker, every farmer, every Australian family. And when even the armed forces begin to question the credibility of American protection, can Australia still consider itself the cornerstone of Western presence in the Pacific? China's subtle offensive. What if China managed to win over Australia without firing a single shot? That is the true shock now emerging. Contrary to the aggressive approach many expected, Beijing is using a quieter but powerful strategy: economics, culture, and technology. According to Nikkei Asia, Chinese funds tied to the China Development Bank have already financed renewable energy and port infrastructure projects on Australian soil. It is estimated that multi-billion-dollar investments are underway in high-speed rail connecting Sydney and Melbourne, while green energy research partnerships link Australian universities with Chinese state companies. All of this is framed as cooperation for the future, but in practice it is creating a dependency that is nearly impossible to break. At the same time, Beijing is working to shape perceptions. Chinese state media in English, such as CGTN, have expanded broadcasts in Oceania, portraying Australia not as a junior Western partner, but as an independent power in the South Pacific. This narrative resonates among young university students who, according to a 2024 survey by the Lowy Institute, already see China as a more reliable economic partner than the United States. Interestingly, even labor unions are part of this equation. According to Reuters, Chinese diplomats have held discreet meetings with union leaders in Melbourne, promising long-term contracts and job security if Australia joins BRICS. For workers facing uncertainty caused by American tariffs, that promise feels concrete, almost tangible. But can a nation truly trust a partner who blends economic concessions with geopolitical goals? Or would Australia simply be trading a distant protector for a controlling neighbor? What seems clear is that Beijing does not force. It seduces. It creates cultural ties, funds research, sponsors jobs, and shapes public narratives. A subtle offensive, but perhaps more effective than any American military base. The pressing question is simple. How long can Australia resist this invisible siege before taking the step that would forever change the balance of power in the Pacific? The West's Trojan horse. If Australia were to join BRICS, it would not merely be a diplomatic shift. It would be a geopolitical earthquake. Internal reports from the United States National Security Council, cited by the Wall Street Journal in 2024, have already warned that such a decision could trigger a domino effect. After Canberra, countries such as New Zealand and the Philippines might follow the same path. A network of alliances built over 70 years could collapse like a house of cards, and the warning signs are already visible. Australian trade depends on China for more than 35%, while the United States represents less than 10%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The mining sector, responsible for much of the nation's trade surplus, sends nearly 80% of its iron ore to Beijing. This reality raises an unavoidable question. How much longer can Australia pretend that its economic survival is not tied to the East? The paradox is cruel. Donald Trump, by imposing tariffs on allies, intended to punish China. Yet, unintentionally, he may have pushed Australia into Beijing's arms. As analyst Rory Medcalf of the Lowy Institute observed, if Australia crosses that line, it will be the first Western country to choose the East over Washington. What once seemed a hypothetical scenario now looms as a calculated risk. For the population, the decision is not simply about geopolitics. It is about jobs, supermarket prices, and long-term stability. Small farmers already recognize that Chinese contracts sustain their families, while American tariffs erode their income. The choice, therefore, is not only political, it is daily, tangible, lived in households across the country. We stand before a historic moment. If Australia joins BRICS, the bloc will no longer be seen as a club of emerging nations, but as an alternative center of global power. The West would lose a strategic ally, and the Asia-Pacific could become the epicenter of a new world order. If you believe that understanding these changes is essential to anticipating the future, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your opinion in the comments. Every voice matters in this global debate. Thank you for watching. The world is in transformation, and we will be here together for every chapter of this story. Until next time.